Welcome to the October 2021 episode of the Family Tree Magazine podcast. I'm Lisa Louise Cook. You know, October is the month of Halloween, and as genealogists, that means we likely have researching the death of our ancestors on our minds. Well, this episode is going to help you out with that. Obituaries are some of the most sought-after death-related records for genealogists, and author Shannon Combs Bennett is here to talk about the history of these important records and where you can find them. In our Best Websites for Genealogy segment, Sunny Morton will continue on with our theme by giving us a head-to-head comparison of the biggest cemetery websites from her article called Heavyweights. In our DNA Deconstructed segment, Your DNA Guide, Diane Southard is back to help answer the question, can I remove my DNA data from online? And then we'll wrap the episode up at the editor's desk, where Family Tree Magazine editor Andrew Cook is going to give us a quick tour of the rest of the September-October 2021 special issue called Grave Research. But first, let's kick off this episode with some tree talk, and we'll do that with social media editor Rachel Christian. There's a lot more to Halloween than just candy and costumes. This spooky holiday has a long history, as well as a rich ethnic background. And that kind of got social media editor Rachel Christian wondering what the DNA test results would look like if Halloween were to take a DNA test. And guess what? She's here to give us that answer. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
This is so cool. I like this article. I think it's cute. And you really dug into the background, the history, the genealogy, if you will, of Halloween. How did the DNA test results come out for Halloween?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, this was a fun little article that me and the editorial team came up with just to present the origins of a holiday, but kind of mirror the format of, DNA test results. So the results are in, and just based off our research, Halloween is mostly European, which probably doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. I think most people know that Halloween comes from All Hallows Eve, which refers to the Catholic observances of All Saints and All Souls Day. But what this article is kind of meant to do is show that there are so many different cultures and traditions around the world that shaped the holidays we know it today. So this was our kind of fun way to explore some of those other traditions. So we decided that, we had to make up our own percentages, obviously. But we decided to attribute 40% of Halloween's ethnicity to the British Isles, mostly due to the Gaelic festival of Samhain, I believe is how you pronounce it. And like so many other traditions around the globe, it celebrates kind of the end of the harvest season and the beginning of the darkest time of the year. And it is a time when the borders between worlds are thinner, so to speak. And so, spirits, souls of the dead can cross them maybe more easily. And Samhain, like a lot of different traditions, incorporate offerings of food, wearing costumes, wearing masks, and just a general connection to otherworldly beings as well as the souls of the dead.
And that was celebrated just about the same time as Halloween, October 31st to November 1st, right?
Yeah, as far as we could tell.
All right, so 40% British Isles. And then you mentioned the Catholic Church influence on it. What was the percentage there, and where did you put the little pin on the map?
So we went with 27% of Halloween's ethnicity from Italy and Greece. So because the Catholic Church calls Rome its home, that's why we decided to attribute that percentage to Italy. Yes, and that is in reference to the Catholic observance of All Saints' Day, which is a feast day that just honors all those who have died and gone to heaven. So if you're not Catholic, you might not know that All Saints' Day is traditionally celebrated with food and parades, and the little kiddos will dress up as their favorite saints. So there's a costume element to that celebration.
Interesting. Okay. And there's the Roman festival that you mentioned in there. So that's the other influence in there that centers this pin right around Italy and Greece. Pomona, is that what it's called?
Yeah, so as we were researching this, we found that it's been theorized that the tradition of bobbing for apples comes from a Roman feast meant to honor the goddess Pomona, who is goddess of fruit and fruit trees. So now that I'm thinking about it, I might think of that festival as more of a cousin holiday to Halloween rather than part of its DNA. But that was the thinking behind that. And that was interesting.
I've always wondered about that. What in the world apples and bobbing for apples had to do with the other part, but that would make sense. There's just a little bit of this influence coming from different areas.
Right. As far as I can tell, the celebration honoring Pomona is more of a fertility and abundance, more of like a harvest festival.
Mm-hmm.
But we decided to count it because bobbing for apples is, traditionally a part of our fall celebrations, including Halloween.
Ah, okay. And the next section of the ethnicity pie here kind of maybe sheds a little bit of light on why jack-o'-lanterns became part of Halloween. Tell us about that.
Yes. So this was probably the most interesting part of writing this article to me, was researching what's called the Polish Halloween. I looked up how to pronounce it. I think it's Dziady, something similar to that. If you look it up on Google Translate, that word actually translates to grandfathers.
Oh.
And I think this holiday is known as kind of like Grandfather's Eve, or like Forefathers' Eve, rather. And it is a holiday that is not as silly and lighthearted as our Halloween, obviously. It's much more serious, and it's all about honoring our ancestors. So some scholars have suggested that this holiday has influenced our tradition of jack-o'-lanterns because the ancient kind of Slavic feast involved making masks, like wooden or clay masks, or I think sometimes even carving gourds to be masks. And they would wear those kind of to honor/impersonate the dead, their deceased relatives. So that's an unanticipated part of these DNA results, but definitely the one that I was the most interested to learn about. And so we attributed 15% of Halloween's ethnicity to this Slavic feast, so this Eastern European tradition.
Once again, DNA influencing facial features, at least of our pumpkins. All right, so we've got 15% of Halloween's DNA left. What is that attributed to?
So we could not, in good conscience, give Halloween its DNA test results without talking about some of the Mexican holidays that we're familiar with and not familiar with. As I was researching, I stumbled across this late summer festival honoring an Aztec goddess whose name I will not even attempt to pronounce. But it's a similar tradition, right? I mean, this was a holiday meant to honor kind of a guardian of the dead. And then the Spanish came over and I'm like merged, their Catholic traditions with the native traditions. And I'm not sure if the connection between that holiday and what we know today is Dia de Muertos, or Day of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
But Day of the Dead certainly is part of how we understand Halloween and all these related celebrations today. I mean, ever since I started looking for it, I see sugar skulls, and I think of the Disney movie Coco even. Day of the Dead, I think, plays a larger role in our North American Halloween than we often give it credit for. So that's why 10% of Halloween's ethnicity was attributed to Mexico. And like all DNA tests, there's just some that we can't account for everything, right? All DNA ethnicity results should be taken with a grain of salt. As much as we want to have everything figured out, we thought it was most accurate and responsible of us to say that 5% is just uncertain. I mean, these are just a small sampling of all the traditions around the globe that are meant to honor the dead and honor our ancestors. Traditions that I'm sure shaped Halloween, our modern Halloween, across the world in one way or another. So to account for all of those and all of our error, 5% is just unknown, uncertain.
Well, that makes sense. That's very responsible of you all.
Well, it's very serious academic work we're doing,
Oh, yes. Well, I imagine that you'll be putting this out to social media and getting other genealogists' input on this.
Yes, I would love to know. how our readers celebrate Halloween, what traditions they grew up with in their families. So we did put out a question to our audience on social media. So we will leave that link in the show notes for you to go check out that conversation and add your own answers.
That sounds great. So you can find Family Tree Magazine at Facebook and Twitter and all of the social media platforms. And of course, as Rachel says, we'll have links in the show notes. Pretty fun. Okay, well, I can rest easy now that I know the ethnicity and makeup of Halloween. It's a good kickoff to this episode. We've got more obituaries and cemeteries and things to talk about, so we will do that. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you, Lisa. It was fun.
Today, we are talking obituaries and the important role that they play in your genealogy. Now, obituaries can reveal a lot of really interesting information about your ancestors. And in the article, A Genealogist's Guide to Finding and Using Historical Obituaries, author Shannon Combs-Bennett explains everything you need to know about using and finding obituaries. Hi, Shannon.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. This is a terrific article, and I just think of obituaries as being such a cornerstone of the work that we do. It's often one of the first places people start, right?
Yeah, it is. They're pretty accessible for most people. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper, the further back in time you go. But they seem to be one of the basic, I guess you could call staples, bread and butter type documents that genealogists try to find.
And we typically find them in newspapers. So I'd love to start there because obituaries are not the only kind of death record we're finding in newspapers, right?
No, it's not. There can be actually several different types of death records published in a newspaper. Of course, the obituary is the most common, but you can also have funeral announcements. So you might not get the obituary, but maybe you can find that the announcement that this funeral home is servicing this family, or that the wake will occur at such and such place, or the religious ceremony will occur at this church with graveside services. In addition to that, you sometimes can find what were called for a long time cards of thanks, where families would put articles in the newspaper, essentially in the advertisement, personal type section, thanking people for coming and participating in the service of their loved one. So there's a wide variety of different types of information that if you don't know it's there, no reason to go look for it.
Exactly. I remember I was doing some newspaper research in the British newspaper archives for my husband's family, and I was floored. Now, this isn't really a death notice, but it's death related, and there was an entire coroner's inquest published in the newspaper. Yeah. And I didn't realize that we could find something like that. So it's wonderful to see the depth of the kinds of information that surround the death of a person that could be found in newspapers.
Right. And those aren't as common here in the United States, but if your loved one died in a larger city, you can sometimes find those in the newspapers. I was doing some research and found from San Francisco, and they have published books of coroner's inquests. So they're not in newspapers, but the announcement was in the newspaper that there was an inquest. And then I could go to the library. Thankfully, these were all digitized, and find them online, where I would find all sorts of information about the person, their family, the circumstances of their death. And if you're doing family medical histories, sometimes those can be real gold mines.
Yes. Well, okay. So let's take a moment and talk about the history of obituaries, because, when we understand, as you know, the history of any kind of genealogical record, then we do a lot better job of utilizing it. So give us a little bit of a background story on obituaries. How long have they been around?
Sure. So you can find obituaries in even some of the earliest colonial newspapers here in the United States. Simply, sometimes they were, somebody passing through, or information from, they had died abroad and it has come back, and there might be a little note in a paper. In the early 1800s, it's going to sound kind of strange, but you can see themes developing around newspaper obituaries. And sometimes, if it was a very important person to the community, you're going to be more than likely to find it. And sometimes unfortunately, I should say, these early newspaper obituaries, they don't have a lot of family information, but you'll find all sorts of virtuous prose written about them, I guess you could say, because they were, talking about, how godly and worthy they were and those types of things. Then the obituary started to morph and actually became a part of the personals and advertisement section of the newspaper. So one reason you may not find information in an obituary for your ancestor is because the family didn't have the money to pay for the obituary to be put in. And if they weren't a real prominent person, they wouldn't get the, prime real estate in the actual reading sections. And so, if your family were on the poorer side, you might not find anything about them, unfortunately. And then as the 20th century came in, it started once again not necessarily a celebration of death, but a celebration of people's accomplishments. Mm-hmm. So you start finding late 1800s into the early 20th century is how the obituary as we know it today started to evolve. It went from maybe 1 or 2 lines about a person dying to, 3 and 4 paragraphs about them, their families, especially if they had, been a pensioner or a veteran, were a pioneer of a town. The early 20th century saw a lot of those people who had, really struck it out west for their fame and fortune, start passing away in those towns. And sometimes you would even find the obituary not only in the place where they died, but in their hometowns back further to the east. So you might find obituaries, especially for those, I guess, pioneering folk, you could call them, back where they came from.
That's a great point. And that's really kind of a nice newspaper research clue, because I think it even expands beyond obituaries, which is that idea of people often started back east, but then relocated out west. And those, particularly I think with the telegraph coming into play, they could send that article back and get it to all those people who would be really interested to know whatever happened to that person.
Right. And of course, now in the 21st century, we're moving more and more away from print newspapers for the obituaries, and we're going to almost completely digital newspapers for the obituaries and digital obituary sites. I know when I've had several of my close family members in the last 10 years who have passed away, the funeral homes are even offering to put obituaries on their sites. And when my mother passed away, I was speaking with the funeral home director, and they had kept records. This was in Texas, and they had records going back several decades with written obituaries that, if you called the funeral home, you could see if they had a written up, not necessarily was ever published in the paper because the family couldn't afford it, but the funeral home had it.
How interesting. I would imagine it's true that in small towns, you might be more likely to find obituaries than perhaps in Chicago.
Yeah, because, everybody knows everybody, small hometown newspaper. Those would be more likely to have the longer, more in-depth information written about a person, talking about their family and their, where they came from, what they did, if they were the pillar of a community or even just, a local farmer. And then the cities are, unfortunately, unless you were a prominent citizen, that's where you're more than likely to find a paragraph or less, maybe only even a few sentences. First and last name, age, died on this date. That may be all you get. unfortunately.
Oh, okay. So let's talk about where to find these historical newspapers.
Sure.
Where do we start?
Okay, well, there's a lot of different newspapers online. Of course, the Library of Congress Chronicling America is a great start. Start there, see if one of your local newspapers or the place that you're researching local to that. See if they have a newspaper for the time frame out there. One, because it's free. I mean, you got to start with the free sources first. Family Search also has a free historical obituary site that you can search. And then you can move into the paid sites where there's newspapers.com and Ancestry, Genealogy Bank. They all have, obviously, newspapers and then obituaries as a part of it. Sometimes you can also contact the local library for the place the person had died. I've had good luck calling, I'm originally from Indiana, and calling around to the various county libraries. And unfortunately, they don't have a lot of the newspapers digitized, but, for a small fee, they were willing to send me a photocopy. And in some cases now I can get emailed PDFs for a few dollars and to support the local library, I'm okay with doing that because our local libraries need a lot of support. So don't give up if you can't find it digitized, is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of places out there, especially for older newspapers. But, just be resourceful, I guess you could say.
Well, and you talked about online indexes. So sometimes we don't get the actual obit right, but we get enough information out of the index that we could then go track it down in person.
Yeah, that's very true. I've used those several times. One of the links that is in the article is to the Dayton, Ohio index, and you can put in as much information as you know. Sometimes I find it's easier to start with a little bit of information and then, sort through and add details to weed through the large number. But all it will give you is the person's name, the date of publication, so not even the date of death, so it's somewhere in that time frame, and then the page, issue, column number, so that you can contact the Dayton Public Library and they can help get you the paper. And there's a lot of the libraries are like that.
Shannon Combs-Bennett, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Let's say you took a DNA test a few years ago and your results are on the testing company's website, but now you've decided you don't want them there anymore. Can you delete your DNA data? Your DNA guide, Diane Southard, is here to help answer that question. Hi, Diane.
Hi, Lisa, and thanks for asking this question. I think it comes up more often than I would expect.
Yeah, and I think it's probably coming up more lately because people are talking about privacy. They're kind of rethinking or just giving more thought to whether they want to keep, personal DNA results out on websites. So let's tackle the question up front. Can we remove our DNA results from a testing company's website?
Yeah, well, the answer there is a confident maybe.
Why am I not surprised?
Isn't that the way it always is? So, yes, for sure, your DNA sample is owned by you, not by the DNA testing company. So you can request that your DNA sample be deleted or your DNA. So there's two parts really. So you've got your DNA sample, the actual physical sample at the testing company, and then you've got the results that they generated through their reporting system. So there are really two parts. You can remove the DNA profile that's on their website from their website. So delete it off their website. But then there's your physical DNA sample. All of our companies actually maintain your physical DNA sample in case you want to go back later and order more testing or for whatever reason. So you'd also want to think about if you want to have them actually destroy your sample. So it's kind of a two-part process, but you absolutely have control over that. You can tell the testing company, you know what, I've changed my mind. Please pull all of my data and destroy my sample.
Interesting. Okay. So now I know in the past we've talked a little bit about some of the programs or surveys or groups that sometimes we can opt in and have them use our data anonymously as part of something else. When we remove our data, does that change that? Does that remove people from those kinds of activities?
Yeah, right. So this is the part that brings in the maybe, right?
Yeah.
So it's a absolutely yes. You can say right now, today, I don't want my data on this testing company website anymore, and they will pull it off. But if you had opted into their research services when you signed up or at any point after, your data has been entered into a study. And you can think about a research project just like you would conduct at your school. Your teacher says, oh, you've got until October 22nd to get this data in, whatever. There's project deadlines and project start and stop dates. So if your data has been entered into a project that is currently ongoing, you cannot pull your data from that project. It's part of that data set that's being analyzed, and it will not be removed from that project. So you can obviously request that you aren't involved in any future projects, but any current projects that your data is a part of, it will continue to be a part of. But as you said, it is anonymous. All of those projects are anonymous.
Which I suppose is why they can't pull it, because they probably couldn't identify you, right?
Exactly. Yeah, good point.
Okay, so do we have any in between? Do we have any alternatives for just straight out deleting your data?
It's such a good question. And you listed some of the reasons in the beginning here about why somebody might be thinking about doing this. And I think some of those reasons are really valid. You took the test without thinking or understanding really what you were getting into. And now you're reading more about a specific company, perhaps, or a policy that they have, and you're not comfortable with that. Our companies are businesses, and they're evolving and changing too. And they may be changing the terms that you originally tested under. They weren't participating in this activity, and now they are. And as a business, they have that right. And maybe you're like, no, thank you. I don't want to be a part of that activity. And that's the reason why you're changing, right? There's also people who have been discovering information about their biological family that's made them really question a lot of these processes, and they're uncomfortable having their data out there now that it reflects something different about their biological family than what they originally intended, and they don't really want that information out right now. And so they're trying to kind of pull back and pull that information back off of the internet so that they have time to process it and understand it before it's kind of out there to the world. So there are lots of reasons why you may be considering doing this. But there really isn't a halfway point. Either you're in the database and available, or you're not. Though there are some kind of workarounds. So for example, at 23andMe, and they've always had this policy, you don't have to make yourself available to your DNA matches. That's a setting that you choose, right? So you can test and you can receive the information and data from their test, but you don't have to share your data with the database, essentially. So they're the easiest company to make that happen at. Ancestry also has that ability for you to essentially pull your name off of the match list. So then it's like you still kind of have all the benefits of your ethnicity report, for example, but your personal matching data is not part of the database.
Oh, very good to know. Okay, well, all of this information we're talking about kind of falls under privacy and privacy concerns around DNA. And of course, Diane has addressed these questions and other questions about privacy in her article on DNA test privacy over at Family Tree Magazine. And so I'm going to have a link for you guys in the show notes so that you can read the entire article. As always, thank you so much for being our DNA guide, Diane.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
So far in this episode, Shannon Combs Bennett helped you find your ancestors' obituary. And now you're ready to locate their final resting place. And that's where author Sunny Morton enters the picture. She's here to help us navigate 3 of the largest cemetery websites that can help you do just that. Welcome back to the show, Sunny.
Thank you, Lisa.
It's wonderful to have you here because this article is going to be a terrific help to us. It appears in the October 2021 issue of Family Tree Magazine. It's called Heavyweights. And you do kind of a head-to-head comparison of the 3 cemetery websites. Tell us which ones you're looking at.
Absolutely. So if we go like even headstone to headstone comparison, it's kind of a sorry. I had to because
I know.
I had to. I just had to go there. So we're looking at Billion Graves. We're looking at Find a Grave, and we're looking at interment.net. And I bet you've heard at least of one of those 3 sites and maybe a couple of them, but maybe Interment.net is new to you. So I think it was really fun to compare the 3 of them and see how they stack up to each other.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with what the similarities are. What do these 3 websites have in common?
It's the tombstones. It's all about the tombstones.
Awesome.
And really, if you're looking for a final resting place, and maybe you found it in that obituary that Shannon was talking about, you're going to want to go look for a burial record of some kind. And so the burial record for each of these, the primary materials that they're looking at, are the tombstones. And so each of these 3 websites has tombstone transcriptions. And on 2 of them, you also find images of these tombstones. So that's a really great help. It's we often only think of our sources in genealogy as documents, but a tombstone is a source. It's a historical source. And it's definitely one we want to find whenever we can.
Absolutely. And they also have something very important in common, which is they're all free. Am I right?
They are all free.
We like
free
that.
is the best. So you can go online and search at Billion Graves or Find a Grave or Interment.net. And I should say and, because you should be searching at all 3 of those. And it is entirely free to search at all of them. Will there be some overlap in what you find or don't find? Absolutely, just like there is at every major genealogy website. But because they're created by, a unique pool of contributors who are taking an interest in different burial grounds from around the world, you do have a good chance of digging in and seeing what you can find and finding the things that you want at each one. So it's because they're free, because they're so easy to search, there's no reason not to search on all 3 of them.
Exactly. Well, now you mentioned 2 of them have images of the tombstones. Which 2 do have the pictures?
So that would be Billion Graves and Find a Grave. And Billion Graves is best known for the GPS tagging that it does of the tombstone. And, you can get that kind of information sometimes over at Find a Grave too. But at Billion Graves, this is like a primary focus for them. Capturing the location of the record is as important as what's written on the tombstone. So for them, they feel like the GPS capture there is part of documenting the record itself, just like a source citation where you say the publisher and the date and the website you found it on, that leads you right to it. Well, the GPS tagged location on a Billion Graves tombstone image leads you right to it. It tells you at least that that's where that tombstone was at the time that it was imaged.
Exactly. And the more information, the better. So now you're kind of leading us down the path where they start to part ways a little bit. Let's talk about what are some of the differences. And one, as you mentioned, that stands out with Billion Graves is the GPS. What else should we be looking for that differentiates them?
All right. Well, in continuing on with Billion Graves, comparing them to Find a Grave. So Billion Graves are just meant to be recordings of this particular source as an original source of material. So it doesn't allow you other users to go in and create memorials and add lots of other things to that particular image. That is supposed to be a standalone historical record. And you don't go in and say, oh, well, that's not actually correct, blah, blah, blah. So that in as of itself is kind of different than what they're doing over on Find a Grave, which is also really great. They're over at Find a Grave, they're more creating lineage linked memorial pages for people. And let me break that down for you just a little bit. So the idea of it being a memorial page is that, yeah, you go ahead and document that tombstone and whatever it says on the tombstone, but then people can also contribute lots of different kinds of information. Say they found that obituary. Say they have a little biographical sketch. They can send that in to the person who manages that memorial or the owner of that memorial. And that person is kind of a gatekeeper to sort of edit and approve information that gets attached to that memorial. So it then becomes a place to collect all of that information for that person. And then the lineage linked part of it is you can also look at Find a Grave as a giant lineage linked tree. almost, because for many of the entries, you're looking not just at that person's burial, but below the memorial image that you see are links to their parents' graves, links to their siblings, their spouses, their children. So all of those first degree relatives. And so that's something that is also unique and really fun. Now, of course, it's only as accurate as the information it was provided with. And you always want to confirm yourself that indeed these are the correct relationships. But a lot of times those are done by people who know something. They have reason for putting that in there. So that is also a really great resource at Find a Grave. Now to pull in interment.net. And this was the one when I started out, Lisa, this is the one I was least familiar with as well. And I was so excited to get to know a little more about them. So we go back to the dawn of the internet era for this. we learned that the creator of this website, Steve Johnson, he started out by just creating a directory of cemetery records on his own personal website. And you know how that's going to explode, right?
Right.
So eventually, people started sending him their own lists of tombstone transcriptions saying, hey, we don't have our own website. Will you please post this for us? And he's I was just pointing to other people's, but he started doing it. And eventually it became what is now known as interment.net. And so it's a little bit different over there because instead of individual records, people submit a list. And maybe it's from their family burial ground, or maybe it's from their neighborhood cemetery or whatever. But they do cemetery transcriptions of the tombstones, and then they upload those entire lists. And you can then, as a user, go in and search in those lists. But it's not the unit that you're looking at. You'll be looking within a list, but the unit that these are submitted at is an entire list. And so you don't have the photographs that go with them and things like that.
How interesting. Now, let's dig into the heart of this, the records. And you have a really nice handy dandy kind of graph on page 14 in this article where you kind of break down some of the highlights of each of the websites and number of records. Why don't you go over that for us?
Sure. Well, let's start with interment.net because we were just talking about them. So just collecting people's, transcriptions, they're up to 25 million cemetery records, which is, really fantastic. And of course, it's from different places around the world. And then we go to the next one would be, I would say, billion graves. And that, if we thought 25 million was a lot, Billion Graves has now 40 million GPS tagged headstones. And then there's some of them that they don't have the headstone images for, but they still have records about them. So 140 million total. But that's so 40 million of them that have the GPS tagged headstones in them. And then if we thought that number was big, then we go over to Find a Grave and we have nearly 200 million gravestone memorials. So 190 million gravestone memorials. And most of those do have pictures with them as well. So, just enormous numbers. Now, when we compare that to how many people have ever died, that's still, we have a long way to go before we have recorded the burial places of everybody on Earth. And certainly we don't know about a lot of them. But this is a lot of data that is so easy to search because all three sites make it really easy to search.
Well, and that brings me to one of my final questions, which people might be already asking themselves is this just the United States or are we talking worldwide?
I tried to see how good of a global comparison I could do, but that's kind of hard to sort everything that way. So, but they are all global. So they're not limiting. Okay. And you can look and you'd be surprised at some of the content you'll find. I think it's going to be strongest for the US, the UK, and other English speaking places. But you'd be surprised at what you find for out of the way places. So certainly think of this not just as a resource for, finding your nearest and dearest, but also maybe people a little further back on your tree or who were buried thousands of miles from where you now live.
I imagine for many of these, you have a lot of volunteers who work on them, so they might be a little more focused on the much older grave sites. Would that be a correct statement?
I would say that that's probably true, especially over at interment.net is where you're going to see some of these compilers that have been doing this for a long time, long before you could, do it individually, stone by stone over at Billion Graves or at Find a Grave, they were compiling these great lists. And a lot of them have made their way to interment.net. And one of the ones, for example, that I give as an example in the article is the British military graveyard in Ballincollig, Ireland. And this person, I was looking at this particular one, and it was really cool because she wasn't just reading the stones. She took what she read from the stones and then went and consulted all kinds of other transcriptions or gravestone inscriptions, church records, death certificates, military records, local newspapers, anything she could find locally to try to put the story of this burial together, this person. Wow. So some of these are really well informed beyond just the basics of a burial information.
Well, you might get lucky depending on who you're looking for.
You might get lucky.
Well, anything else that will help us get lucky? Do you have any tips or suggestions, tricks for us?
Well, I absolutely suggest going to the article itself because I gave a lot of step-by-step tips for using and searching the websites. And especially if you want to, at a couple of them, you're allowed to, send in some additional information or clarification. And I give you tips for what you can and can't do, kind of the changes that can and can't be made to help make these records more accurate. So definitely go to the article itself. It's got a lot for you there.
Excellent. Well, the article is called Heavyweights, and it is in the September-October 2021 issue of Family Tree Magazine. Always good to talk to you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Well, as we wrap up this episode, of course, we always like to stop by the editor's desk to see what's going on over at Family Tree Magazine. And this month, we've got Andrew Cook, the editor of the magazine. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Lisa.
Well, we've been really digging into cemeteries and obituaries and graves and all kinds of things in this episode. And that's kind of the theme you've got going on in the September-October 2021 issue of the magazine as well, isn't it?
Yeah, we thought, just in time for Halloween and the celebration of All Souls Day on November 1st, that we'd dedicate this issue all to grave research.
Cool. Well, we've talked to Sunny Morton, so we talked about her terrific article, the Heavyweights article, and we talked a lot about the website, but you've got a couple other really good features in here, and one of them seems to be kind of around the area of preserving tombstones, and since we may be visiting graves here to do some research, what kind of tips do you have from that article?
Yeah, the article's by an author named Joy Neighbors. She's been on the podcast before, and she blogged at A Grave Interest, and cemeteries are really her thing. And she shares some great tips for how to approach a tombstone that you think might be damaged, how to recognize what the damage is, and really, and I think this is important too, to recognize what you can and cannot fix yourself. As many of us, I know I certainly don't have the right expertise or equipment to repair large cracks and that kind of thing by myself. So that's one of my big takeaways from her article, was sort of know what your limits are, know what your expertise is, and know when to consult an expert too.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of us have been doing genealogy for a long time. There was a day where you could just head to the nearby cemetery and you could, touch it, clean it up, do whatever you wanted. Mm-hmm. But that's not so much the case. People are more careful about that because it can cause damage, right?
Right. And so I know Joy really focuses on what you can do to enhance letters on tombstones using water, using smaller tools like scissors to clean up grass around a tombstone rather than doing anything that's going to be too caustic or damage the stone further.
Yeah, and of course, bring your trusty camera. I know Joy is an avid photographer, and that's another terrific way to capture the information instead of doing the old-fashioned rubbings, which we highly discourage. What are the kinds of articles? Gosh, there's a couple of things you've got. Well, you've got an article in here. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I wanted to take us back to the basics with source citation. I know that it's something that a lot of people maybe feel some anxiety about, or I compare it to flossing your teeth or doing your taxes, that kind of thing that nobody wants to do, but you really should. And so we look at some different ways of approaching source citations, what key kind of information you want to include in there, and how to make it a little less scary, a little less tiresome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got my Lisa's Picks column, and I'm harvesting in this column. I went up to my friend's homestead and helped them. I learned how to drive a tractor, Andrew. Can you believe that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I have the picture.
There's a great photo of you in there on one. And
exactly.
Yeah, really fun.
Yes. So I hope everybody will check that out. And I've got a couple of, again, some of my favorite picks for things that you'll want in your genealogy toolkit. So there's lots to glean from the September-October 2021 issue of Family Tree Magazine. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for joining me for this October 2021 episode of the Family Tree Magazine podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast and you're listening to the show through one of the popular podcast apps, maybe over at Apple or Google Podcasts, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review, and that will help tell other genealogists about this show. And as always, I'll have links to everything we talked about in today's episode at familytreemagazine.com/podcast. Again, don't miss the special September-October 2021 issue of Family Tree Magazine. It's called Grave Research. It's available now. We'll have a link in the show notes where you can pick up a digital copy if you don't already have it over at our store, or of course, subscribe to the magazine. And in addition to all the great articles we talked about today, take a look for Lisa's picks. It's there every issue. And this month, it's bushels full of ancestors, just in time for the fall harvest. Thanks again for joining me. I'm Lisa Louise Cook, and you can visit me over at my website, genealogygems.com, and there you'll find the Genealogy Gems podcast and my weekly YouTube live show. And don't miss Family Tree Magazine on YouTube as well. Just do a quick search for Family Tree Magazine in the search field at youtube.com. Until next time, have fun climbing your family tree.